Thanks to At Home for joining us this hour. Happy to have you with us. Boy, there's a lot going on, right? It's one of those times I feel very, very blessed to have this job. In March of this year, a guy who was going to run for Senate in Nevada announced that he was not going to run after all. He said, quite proudly, that the only reason he was backing out was because he had personally received a call from the President of the United States and the President's team imploring him for the good of the Republican Party to please not run for Senate this year as he was otherwise intending. The White House later confirmed that, in fact, the president had done that. The president had called this guy in Nevada, Danny Tarkanian, who's somebody who's run for office a lot in Nevada. He's lost every time. The president had called him and told him not to run for the Senate this year so as to clear the way for Republican U.S. Senator Dean Heller to run for re-election in Nevada without the hassle of having a Republican primary challenge. So the president intervened to keep that primary challenger out, to clear the way for Dean Heller, so Dean Heller could be re-elected. Trump-endorsed Senator Dean Heller last night lost his re-election race. He lost his seat in the U.S. Senate. He was beaten by a Democrat named Jackie Rosen. Now, Jackie Rosen was a Democratic member of Congress who had to give up her seat in Congress in order to run against Dean Heller. That obviously was a good bargain for her. She'll be coming back to Washington as a U.S. Senator instead of as a member of Congress. But because she had to leave her seat in Congress in order to run for the Senate, that left her congressional seat open. And this was where the Trump genius came in. Having advised Danny Tarkanian that he wasn't allowed to run in the Senate primary against Dean Heller so as to ensure that Dean Heller would hold on to his seat, Trump then promoted the heck out of Danny Tarkanian to get a different gig, to be the Republican nominee for that House seat, for the one that was vacated by Congresswoman Jackie Rosen. Well, last night, that Trump-endorsed candidate, Danny Tarkanian, he lost that race, too. He lost that House seat to a Democrat named Susie Lee. But the president believes he has real political genius when it comes to these things, and he is not shy about doing this sort of thing anywhere in the country. Just a few weeks after that brilliant Danny Tarkanian presidential intervention that cost the Republicans both a seat in the United States Senate and a seat in the United States House, the president waded into another race in South Carolina, where he decided that in a congressional primary in South Carolina, he would direct his followers to no longer support Republican Congressman Mark Sanford. The president decided that Mark Sanford was insufficiently pro-Trump for a Republican member of Congress. And so before the polls closed in that congressional primary where Mark Sanford was trying to hold on to his seat, the president just cannonballed into the deep end with this endorsement, quote, "Mark Sanford has been very unhelpful to me in my campaign to MAGA. He is MIA and nothing but trouble. I fully endorse Katie Arrington for Congress in South Carolina. Vote Katie." Well, Katie Arrington, on the strength of that last-minute, high-impact endorsement from the president, she beat Mark Sanford in that primary. The president has been gleefully rubbing that in against Mark Sanford ever since, sort of pounding his chest about how he cost Mark Sanford his seat in Congress. I am POTUS, hear me roar. Well, last night was the general election in South Carolina, just like it was everywhere. And last night, presidentially endorsed Katie Arrington lost that seat to a Democrat whose name is Joe Cunningham. Did I mention that was South Carolina? Just won by a Democrat. A few weeks after President Trump applied his unparalleled presidential political genius to the Katie Arrington-Mark Sanford race, which cost the Republicans a seat in the House, the president also confidently waded in to the Kansas governor's race. When Republican voters in Kansas were deciding this year who was going to be their candidate for governor, they had a choice between a sort of normal conservative Republican or a much Trumpier choice named Chris Kobach. Immensely controversial, very high-profile Kansas Secretary of State, sort of a special White House advisor on non-existent voter fraud. In that Kansas primary to decide who the Republican Party's candidate would be for governor in Kansas, the president once again decided that he would exert his political genius and weigh in. This was in August. He announced his full and total endorsement in that primary for Chris Kobach. Kobach won that primary, presumably in part on the strength of the president's endorsement. Chris Kobach went on to the general election last night as the Republican candidate for governor in Kansas. And he is the Republican candidate for governor who lost the Kansas governorship to a Democrat named Laura Kelly. And it wasn't even that close. And Chris Kobach's dead weight at the top of the ticket in Kansas may have also been enough to cost Kansas Republican Congressman Kevin Yoder his seat as well. I mean, Chris Kobach lost the Kansas governorship last night to a Democrat. Congressman Kevin Yoder lost his congressional seat to a Democrat as well, to a gay Native American female MMA fighter named Sharice Davids, who's a Democrat. Because the president's political genius knows no bounds. Republican Congressman Dave Brat of Virginia. Do you remember when he complained during the campaign about all the women getting up in his grill? How much he hated his female constituents pressuring him to hold a town hall? How much he hated all that? Last night, Dave Brat got all the women out of his grill. That won't be a problem anymore. Last night, Dave Brat lost his seat in Congress to a Democratic woman named Abigail Spanberger, who was a CIA veteran. Do you remember all the indivisible protests against Republican Congressman Rodney Frelinghuysen in New Jersey? Last night, the Rodney Frelinghuysen seat also flipped to a Democrat, to a Democratic woman veteran named Mikey Sherrill. Do you remember the indivisible protests against Republican Congressman Darrell Issa in California? Last night, Darrell Issa's seat in Congress went to a Democrat as well, went to a Democrat named Mike Levin. Republican Congressman Scott Taylor in Virginia. You might remember he got in fairly serious trouble this year during the campaign when he and his office tried on a little fraudulent scheme to fake petition signatures to get a fake third-party candidate onto the ballot to hopefully divert votes from the Democrat who was running against him. Well, last night, Republican Congressman Scott Taylor in Virginia lost his seat in Congress when that Democratic challenger, Elaine Luria, she beat him anyway. In Minnesota, a Republican congressman named Jason Lewis, he's had the whole idea of Minnesota nice, sort of straining at the seams a little bit. Congressman Jason Lewis is the one who publicly complained at length and on tape that he's not allowed to call women sluts anymore. Last night, Minnesota Republican Congressman Jason Lewis lost his seat in Congress to a woman who actually seems very nice, no matter what he might call her. Her name is Angie Craig. And she will soon be Congresswoman Angie Craig because she is the Democrat who has ousted Republican Jason Lewis from Congress. In New York State, John Faso ran ads against his opponent, who was a freaking lawyer and a Rhodes Scholar, trying to make his constituents believe that his opponent was some kind of crazy gang member who was only running for Congress so he could, like, beat people up in the district or something. It was insane. It was very blatantly racist. John Faso lost his seat in Congress last night to that Democratic candidate, Antonio Delgado. In Michigan, Mike Bishop last night lost his seat in Congress to a Democratic candidate named Alyssa Slotkin. She's another CIA veteran. Do you remember that ad this year that highlighted the national security backgrounds of 8 first-time female Democratic candidates who are running this year? Alyssa Slotkin was one of the women in that ad. 5 of the 8 women in that ad won their seats last night and ousted Republican incumbents. In California, Republican Congressman Steve Knight just lost his seat to Democrat Katie Hill. She will be taking Steve Knight's seat in the House. In Illinois, Republican Congressman Randy Hultgren lost his seat to a nurse, a Democratic candidate named Lauren Underwood. Lauren Underwood and Randy Hultgren, for that matter, neither of them were on anybody's radar. Lauren Underwood came out of nowhere and won that seat through sheer hard work and raw talent. Lauren Underwood is going to be a national star, I am telling you. She's actually going to be our guest here a little later on this hour. You are going to want to see that. Last night, Democrats flipped control of the Colorado Senate and the Maine Senate and the Minnesota House and the New Hampshire House and the New Hampshire Senate and the New York State Senate. In Nevada, actually, Democrats got everything. They got the governorship. They took away Dean Heller's U.S. Senate seat. They came within 1 vote of a Democratic supermajority in both houses of the Nevada legislature. In Wisconsin, not only did Democrats take away Scott Walker's governorship, but U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin, who had once been the #1 Republican target for her Senate seat this year, she not only won re-election over a Trump-endorsed opponent, she absolutely crushed it, double digits. Democrats won the Attorney General's race in Wisconsin as well. Democrats did lose U.S. Senate seats last night in states where Trump had won by double digits. And the Florida Senate race looks like it's going to a recount. Although we did learn today that Jon Tester in Montana, Democrat Jon Tester, looks to have held on to his seat. In Georgia, the governor's race there will be an ongoing, all-out battle, where honestly we have now entered into the sort of civic nightmare scenario where it's going to come down to fragile little thin margins of disparate absentee and provisional ballots from all over the state and maybe a recount, and all of it's going to be overseen by one of the two candidates who is also in charge of doing all that counting. Tonight, remarkably, Republican Secretary of State Brian Kemp tried to have his office, his Secretary of State office, announce that he had won the election, but with no details to back it up. Democratic candidate Stacey Abrams is not having it. She has announced that her campaign has started an all-out ballot chasing program to make sure that Kemp is not allowed to determine his own fate and that every single vote is counted in a way that is fair and transparent and provable. That Georgia governor's thing is going to be a big national deal for a long while yet. National eyes will be on that for good reason until that one is settled. There are ongoing races that are as yet uncalled. It may be deep into this weekend before we know who won the Arizona Senate race, for example. There are absurdities in last night's results as well, like count them two, Republican members of Congress who have each been charged with multiple felonies. They're both literally on trial for multiple felony corruption counts. They both got reelected in Republican districts. Congressman Chris Collins in New York and Congressman Doug Hunter in California. They will soon presumably be able to simultaneously solicit new campaign contributions from their sucker constituents, along with requests for additional donations to go into the commissary accounts that each of these guys is likely to soon have in federal prison. I mean, honestly, you can buy them phone cards or you can help them run for re-election, right? Send them Fritos, right? I mean, are these guys going to still get to do constituent service hours like at visiting time? You have an issue you need your congressman to help you with, you just go down, you sit across the glass, you pick up the phone. Can you still be on a committee if you're in prison? So there were some absurdities. Last night was a wild night. Veteran Texas Republican congressmen like Pete Sessions, 11 terms, Pete Sessions, and John Culberson, they lost their seats to Democrats in Texas. A Republican congressman from Oklahoma City, a race that barely anybody had even bothered to poll. He lost his seat to a Democratic woman named Kendra Horn. Steve Russell, Republican congressman of Oklahoma, will be going home. Kendra Horn, Democratic congresswoman from Oklahoma, has taken his seat. The Democrats broke supermajorities in the North Carolina House and in the North Carolina Senate, and in the Michigan Senate, and in the Pennsylvania Senate. The number of states where Democrats have complete control in state government went from 8 before last night to 14 as of today. That means control of the governorship and both houses of the legislature. But the story of the night and the determinative political change that we just went through last night as a country is what happened thanks to the Democrats just romping in the House. Nancy Pelosi will be Speaker of the House once again. Adam Schiff will lead the Intelligence Committee. Gerald Nadler will run the Judiciary Committee. Elijah Cummings will run House Oversight. Oversight, did somebody say?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.